Morning, everybody. It's great to see all of you this morning, right before Thanksgiving. So I always forget. It always sneaks up on me. It just kind of, it's there, you know. Thanksgiving break, what? So it just kind of happens. But it's always good to be with the brethren during this time, because I'm truly thankful that we're able to come together and be a part of the same family. The church family is such an important part of all of our lives, and I don't think we could imagine life without it. I'm so thankful that we have each other and that we can be grateful for God bringing us together from all different walks of life, from all different places, for us to be part of the same church family. Why does the center of a target matter? For years, the term bullseye came around the 1880s when I think the British were doing some kind of shooting, and they would shoot through an actual bull's skull to show their skill. Kind of a weird way of doing it. But the bullseye was to show just how accurate a person could be. And dartboards, archery, guns, that we know, we're familiar with the target. And it's not good enough if a person wants to be good at anything to get sort of the edge of the target, or even in the, sort of closer to the center. You want to hit the bullseye. You want to hit straight on and say, I hit my target. Because when you have a bullseye, the idea is that the place you're shooting for, that's what you want to hit. That's where what you're going for. It's the center, the place where you really want to succeed. And I think in life, what centers us is important. The bullseye, so to speak, the place that we really want to arrive at. We need a focus and we need a goal. We can't be aimless in life, just kind of living so that we're done with the next day and the next day, and then we die. I mean, that's not life, just kind of living and making it from day to day. There has to be something more than that. And as we've been talking about gratitude, the hidden power of gratitude, I truly believe that gratitude centers us. It gives us a goal. It gives us a place where we want to be. It takes us from kind of doing things for our own sake and doing things for the sake of the one whom we are grateful for, whom we thank with our lives and with our livelihood and with everything that we are, everything that we have. So as we conclude the hidden power of gratitude, I want to turn your attention to Mark chapter 12, starting in verse 41. Now imagine, if you would, there's this woman that goes into the temple. She's probably been seen before, but she's probably not noticed by too many people. She's a widow at the time, and widows had very little status in Jewish society. They really didn't have a way of taking care of widows as we sort of do today. There wasn't any kind of government program to take care of widows. If you didn't have children, you were kind of sunk, and you just had to scrape by with whatever meager means you could. So whenever she went to the treasury to give that day, probably nobody noticed her. And probably nobody would have noticed the small amount of money that she put into the treasury box that day, except there was a guest who was watching people give in the treasury that day. Verse 41 of Mark 12, now Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw how the people put money into the treasury. And many who were rich put in much. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which makes a quadrans. So he called his disciples to himself and said to them, assuredly I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all those who have given to the treasury, for they all put in out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had, her whole livelihood. I just want to point out how intimidating it would be for me if Jesus was watching me give. In general, that's a scary thought. But here he was sort of observing, people watching, as Jesus often did, and he noticed the way that people gave. And he knew the hearts of every person who gave. He knew what they had. He knew what their intentions were because he's Jesus. So he points to this widow that no one else probably had noticed that day. He said, I want you to see what she gave. I want you to see how she gave. I want you to remember its importance. The statement that Jesus made demonstrates how gratitude can center you on the things that are most important. So what was it about this woman's giving that caught Jesus' attention? How does gratitude center you? Well, as we look at Jesus' comment on the woman's gift, we see that gratitude implies something the woman had that many of the rich who gave that day did not. Gratitude centers us on our relationship with God. Now, how do we know that she had a relationship with God? Because she was giving her last 2 coins knowing that God provided for her. Otherwise, I don't think she would have given that day. I don't know how you can give everything you have. It wasn't just a throwaway act. It was most likely something she had planned on doing, knowing what she had left, knowing what she had in her stores, and she gave her last 2 and said, this is for the Lord. She had to have been a woman of faith, a poor widow who could easily end up on the street or worse if she ran out of funds. And here she was giving everything. She had to trust in the one who provided for her. I've often found in my ministry that widows are some of the most faithful and godly people I've known because of their trust in the Lord. If they don't have a spouse, they don't have children that can take care of them, but yet they trust in the living God. I've known some whose giving would make me feel bad. Their heart, their sacrifices they've made would make me feel small, but yet they continue to give when they have nothing to offer. And so this woman was one of those who really had nothing to give. I'm sure that the leaders of the temple would see her sacrifice and say, that's nothing. That does nothing for our treasury. That does nothing for God. That's such a small, insignificant amount. And really her value to them was probably very small. She's just a poor widow woman. She doesn't contribute much. But Jesus saw through it. He knew that her relationship with God is why she was willing to give so much that day. A widow in that time giving 2 mites was the equivalent of a few dollars. Can you imagine someone that was so poor that all they had in their name was a few dollars? All they had. And here she was handing it into the treasury box. The faith of that woman must have been great. The trust that she had in her Creator. When we talk about gratitude, those who are grateful are not those who have the most, but those who trust the most. Our trust is what centers us on God. That's something that defies the amount of money we make, and it doesn't have anything to do with our ability to give anything of ourselves. It simply says that this is what we find that is of value to us. For the widow woman, she gave these 2 mites because her trust in God was more important than the small amount of money that she had, that she should have clung to. In fact, I'm sure a lot of people, if they knew that she had given everything she had, they would have said, you foolish woman, what are you thinking? That's all you have. How could you give that up? And I'm sure she had a very small amount of revenue coming in, but she decided that day that she would give everything that she had currently. They would say, why don't you save up? Why don't you hold on to that? That's a mistake that you're making. But for her, her trust in God was greater than her fear of what might happen if she lost everything. And indeed, she gave everything to the Lord that day. We're told in Isaiah chapter 26, verse 3, one of my favorite verses, that you will keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on you because he trusts in you. Notice that the only prerequisite for God keeping and holding this person together is the fact that they trust you. You will keep him in perfect peace. Said nothing about their financial situation, said nothing about their health, said nothing about their circumstances, their life circumstances. He said, if you trust in him, he will keep you in perfect peace. He will keep you exactly where you need to be. Why? Because you trust him. You don't trust anything else. We might get the impression that it was the widow who would be the most concerned about finances. I mean, after all, talk about living paycheck to paycheck. It was beyond that for her. But for her, the gift she gave shows that her faith in God was absolute. It was the people who had plenty who had fear of losing everything. It was the people who were rich who weren't able to comprehend what the woman that day did, because their trust was not the same as her trust in God. You ever seen any of these shows on about hoarders, people who hoard stuff in their house? There seems to be 20 of them these days when I'm looking for something to watch. And a lot of times it's people who just, maybe it's a mental issue, maybe it's just they don't want to get rid of anything, but they have piles and piles of stuff buried in their house, and some of it's just trash. Others, they end up finding valuable things in their house, but they just can't get rid of anything. They just can't throw anything out, so it continues to go more and more to where they just have all these things, all this stuff, and none of it is really valuable because they're missing this peace of mind that comes when you actually have sort of a clean home and you can see things. You can cook on your stove because it's not full of stuff. This woman was not a hoarder. She did not put value in possessions or money. For her, she had but one treasure in her life. She had the Lord. Jesus pointed her out because her faith caused her to give everything of value to her back to the one who was of true value in her life. Now, I don't know about you, but when I see what she did, it makes me rethink my life and what I hold on to and what I think is valuable. I mean, I've held on to plugs and cords that I think are going to be useful someday for 5 years. I promise you, none of them are going to be useful to me. But I just can't get rid of it because it has value. At the end of this life, we know nothing we see or touch or have in our bank account or keep in our house will have any value to us. Then we will know what is of true value in our lives. Gratitude caused her to see that her relationship with God was the most important thing in her life. More important than wealth, more important than the 2 mites that she had in her hand, more important than anything. When we see the relationship that the widow had with God and her trust in giving all she had, we also see an obvious difference between her gift and the gift of those who were rich. Gratitude centers us on generosity. Would you call the widow who gave the 2 mites generous? I don't know anything about this woman except for this particular instance. But do you think she was the type that would give you the shirt off her back? You think she was the type that took care of people who were sick or in need? Now, I'm merely speculating. But when you look at this sacrifice, it does imply a lot, doesn't it? She had to be a woman whose generosity motivated and moved her. She was a woman that was free with what she had because of what she had been given, the value of what God had been meant to her and given her in her life. And in her long years, she had learned that her gratitude should equal her generosity. Because the purpose of gratitude is to mirror the heart of God in our actions towards Him and towards others. Why are some people generous and some people are not? Because their gratitude reflects their generosity. I really believe that. I find myself lacking sometimes in gratitude because I know I'm not being as generous as I should towards people in need, towards people who need me. I'm going to pick on Joshua a little bit because he's right there, and I haven't messed with him in so long. When he was much younger than he is now, we give each kid a certain amount of money for their birthday. The first thing he wanted to do was to buy gift cards to give to our Community Link mission, which was the group that kind of helped people who were poor. And I remember around that same era, him just crying in the back seat because he was thinking about all the poor people who slept on the street. You know, me and Loretta are just bawling because we're seeing this, but he had a heart that truly looked after those in need. And it touched all the hearts of the people at Community Link. It inspired them, this little kid who uses birthday money to help somebody else. And he still has that generous heart. But that story, it just reminds me, when you have a pure heart of gratitude for what God has done, how open you are to helping people and going out on a limb for people, how open you are to giving back to the God who loves you, not because it's some kind of rule or because you want to look good like the people who gave out of their abundance, but because you are truly thankful and you just want to show God, I love you and I'm thankful for all that you've done. It should be a natural thing for us to be generous. We should be the most generous people in the world, and I hope that we are. This church is good at being generous and helping people. But let me tell you, we want to make sure that while we're doing our Thanksgiving feast and eating turkey and eating way too much, an abundance that we have, that we're truly practicing gratitude in our generosity, in our kindness, in the way that we treat others, in the way that we show God that we are thankful for all that He's done for us and continues to do. When we're generous, we are showing our gratitude for all that God's done by our willingness to go above and beyond what is expected of us. Matthew 5, sort of the end of the Sermon on the Mount, or a lot of the things that he's saying. And he says some things. He has this list of things where he says, what do you do more than others? He says, it's been heard, it's been said, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, and then he has all of these different things that we ought to consider. What do you do more? Because the Christian life is not doing enough. It's not just doing what everybody else does. It's not loving those who love you. It's not lending to those who can pay you back. Truly following Jesus is about doing more than others. And that's a question that haunts me. What do I do more than others? What's the difference? What was the difference between all of these guys who had a lot of money and they gave generously? And I'm sure that everybody who saw them give, well, a lot of them probably made a big show of it and wanted people to know how they give, because Jesus condemned the Pharisees for that very thing in another place. And yet what they gave was out of their abundance. It didn't really mean that much to them. It wasn't an act of generosity. It was an act of pomposity, if anything. It did the exact opposite of what it should have done, which was to get their heart right with God, to truly say, Father, I'm so grateful for all you've done. But it just didn't sit right. It wasn't what this woman did. There was a difference in how she gave versus how they gave, because her heart was truly generous, because she had felt the love of God. She had felt the presence and the power of God in her life. Those who are generous will be generous in all things: time, resources, money, and their very lives, because we know that God is the source of all good things. Have y'all heard of the phrase shrinkflation before? Anybody? You know what that is? It's where companies who are dealing with inflation decide that instead of raising the prices of your candy bar or your breakfast cereal, they're just going to shrink what you get. And they do it in such a way that they hope that people won't notice. Have you ever noticed a cereal box just a little bit smaller than what you got when you were a kid? It's less stuff, but it's the same price because they're trying to save money, right? They're trying to make money. And so this shrinkflation is a sort of form of their own inflation. They're making you pay the same amount for less, which means they're making you pay more. Now, before you get angry with them, this has been going on for a long time, right? They're going to keep doing that. Pretty soon we'll have boxes this big for the same amount. I mean, that's just the way it goes. But people won't notice because it's slow. It's deliberate, right? Do we ever withhold anything in our lives from God because we don't want to lose what we have? Do we withhold our time? Do we withhold our energy? Do we withhold our goods because we're afraid of losing something of great value? That's not generosity, that's fear. We need to be people who are motivated by our great love for our Creator, thankful that He gave His only begotten Son, thankful that He's giving us heaven, and not so stingy with the things, the small things that God has given us in this life, realizing that our response to God's graciousness should move us and motivate us. Not out of duty, not out of necessity, but because we are cheerful in what we give. We are faithful in what we give. We are honest in what we give. So taking generosity in a relationship with God, being at the center of the widow's gift, what really made the difference between her gift and the gift of those around her is that on that day, what it meant to her personally, the hidden power of gratitude is that it centers us on sacrifice. Did the woman sacrifice something that day when she put the 2 mites in the treasury box? You bet she did. It hurt. She didn't have a safety net. She didn't have a 401k. She didn't have a savings account. She had nothing when she left that treasury box except that she had made a sacrifice to her Creator. And she had gotten the attention of the Lord of the universe, the praise of the Lord of the universe. Think about that. Jesus Christ commended that woman for what she did that day because she made a sacrifice. No one else there had made that kind of sacrifice. In fact, to them, he said, who gave out of their wealth and of their abundance. There wasn't a sacrifice made. It didn't hurt them. It didn't put a dent in them. It didn't make them afraid. How am I going to make it if I give this much? How am I going to do things? How am I going to pay bills if I give this much? Their generosity was controlled more by what they could get away with giving and still look good instead of what they could give as a true sacrifice to their Creator. And let me tell you, I don't like the idea of self-sacrifice. It's one of the least attractive things that God commands us to do because it means that it hurts. Have you ever given to where it hurts? You ever given in such a way, whether it's money or time, that it affects you, that it causes you to have greater faith in God? I'm not saying that all of us have to empty our bank accounts or that all of us have to spend every waking moment at the church building. What I'm saying is, if Jesus were at the treasury today, watching us, seeing our hearts, would we be people willing to sacrifice to Him? Or would we be people who are too selfish or too fearful to give until it hurts? Again, this is about your relationship with God. It's not about the church. It's not about anything that the church does. It's about your faith in God and your love for God. Do we sacrifice? From the beginning, when Cain and Abel were told to sacrifice, Abel gave a greater sacrifice than Cain. Why? Because he put his heart into it. He put something that hurt him into it. Whatever the difference between their sacrifices, his meant something. When we give on Sunday morning, it should mean something. When we give our time during the week, it should mean something. When we give our hearts to the Lord, when we give our songs of praise, it should mean something. Because one thing God hates more than anything else is empty, worthless worship. Jesus said, they honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Those rich guys who gave a lot, their hearts were not in their giving, and therefore God was not pleased with their sacrifice. But for the woman who gave the 2 mites, he was well pleased with her because she was truly a daughter of God. Folks, it's hard to give until it hurts. It's hard to sacrifice. It's hard to give ourselves to our God, but think of who He is and what He's done and why it matters. Because people look at the church and they say, well, they're always asking us to give money and all this other stuff. Let me tell you, I'm not asking you to give anything, but I'm asking you to consider your relationship with God. Are you generous to God? Are you sacrificing your life to God? Because that matters. In the grand scheme of things, that 2 mites did not keep the temple running. That 2 mites did not pay for the priests to have a good life. That 2 mites was nothing compared to the huge amount of money that these other guys gave. But that woman's heart mattered so much to God that now she is famous in the New Testament because Jesus saw her heart and her sacrifice and He commended it. That's what we're faced with as Christians. Are we really sacrificing? Or are we reserving the best part of ourselves for our own lives? Are we holding back because we're afraid of losing something precious when we've been given something far more precious than jewels and money and time and energy and health? How much do we love God? Do we love Him enough to sacrifice to Him our time and efforts? I love Romans chapter 12. It paints a picture so perfectly. I beseech you, Romans 12 verse 1, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable God, which is your reasonable service. He's not saying, I beseech you to give some cash here and there. I beseech you to come on Sunday mornings and punch your attendance card. He says, give your whole body. Give your whole life. Because that is your reasonable act of service to the God who made you, saved you, delivered you, and loves you more than anyone else. If anyone is deserving of our praise, of our generosity, of our heart, it is our Father in heaven and our Lord Jesus Christ. Can you think of anyone who deserves what we have more? My hope and prayer is that we're people who are centered on what is most important, that we are centered on our relationship with God, that we are centered on our generosity before God and man, and that we are centered on giving a sacrifice and being a sacrifice before the throne room of God. If you were to be measured by your willingness to sacrifice today, how would you be measured? Which group would you belong to? The widow or the rich man? It's your choice. If you haven't been baptized into Christ, the good news is that we receive a free gift when we receive the gospel. Our sins are washed away. Our promise to be in heaven is guaranteed for those who follow Him and are faithful to Him. And our life is so much greater when we know that God is with us and for us. To be immersed in Christ changes everything for the sinner and brings us to God and gives us His Spirit. And for those of you whose hearts have not been melted by God's love for you, let us be people of gratitude right now as together we stand and sing.